which I serve as director. This is our first true big-scale, large-scale, in-person public event. And so thank you all for being a part of that, helping us celebrate, kick off. Let me back up momentarily and say I'm Rebecca Tromble. As I noted, I'm the director of the Institute, or IDDP. I'm also an associate professor here in the School of Media and Public Affairs. IDDP has received generous support from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which has allowed us to bring you all here, bring these excellent panelists and our keynote speaker here together to discuss this incredibly important topic. We are joined as co-sponsors. IDDP is joined by the School of Media and Public Affairs here at GW, as well as the Election Coverage and Democracy Network. And really, it's the work of that network, ECAD for short, and the mission that they have inspired that leads us to this conversation. The ECAD network is an initiative of more than 70 media and politics experts who have come together to really try to help strengthen reporting on democracy and democratic processes, recognizing the challenges and pressures that news managers, journalists, and news organizations face in an environment where traditional reporting norms may actually be helping to elevate the voices of those who actively seek to undermine democracy. We hope today to raise vital, important questions, at times even provocations, that allow us to rethink what it means to responsibly report on politics, on democratic processes. But before we move into this conversation, I'd like to first welcome GW's President Mark Wrighton, who is going to say a few words for us. President Wrighton, welcome.
Thanks very much, Dr. Tromble. It's really great to be here, and this program, sponsored by the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics, is a continuing part of our community here at GW. Just yesterday, in this very setting, we had a discussion of Supreme Court confirmations, and we had a very talented and interesting panel discussing the issues that will confront the new court that's just starting today. And a week ago, we also had a very interesting program discussing finding common ground on guns. And today's program continues this very interesting area of discussion, Media for Democracy, covering elections amidst democratic crisis. At our university, our students, faculty, and staff are working to address some of the most challenging problems of our time. Among these challenges is the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation, which greatly impacts our perspectives and ability to work together to solve the critical problems that we face. These problems are ones that we have to address, and I'm very grateful that this meeting has been convened for a discussion of great importance right before us. The midterm elections next month now are going to be very significant for the nation, and arguably, considering the global challenges that we're participating in solving, this will be important for the world. I'm very proud that the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics, the School of Media and Public Affairs, and the broader GW community are playing a leadership role in coming together to discuss some of these great problems. Thank you all for being with us today, and I'm looking forward to our keynote presentation and our panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, President Wright, and your leadership and support for this and so much of our work is greatly appreciated. President Wright briefly noted the challenges of the moment. The political environment was already tense, already charged, when in the spring of 2021, the coronavirus pandemic hit and changed and turned many of our lives completely upside down. What we saw during that moment was that high levels of distrust in political institutions, in media institutions, only grew. And the consequences of that distrust are unfortunately not hypothetical. 635 days ago, at almost exactly this hour, thousands of American citizens began attacking police, breaking their way into the Capitol building in a failed attempt to overturn a free and fair election. The coup may have failed, but the threat to democracy has not gone away. If anything, it's gotten worse. Millions of Americans continue to believe the big lie. State legislatures are actively disenfranchising voters, making it more difficult for citizens to exercise their most basic and fundamental democratic right. And quite frankly, if we were not in DC, not at George Washington University, many of the colleagues who have joined us here today would not be able to hold this sort of public conversation. They would risk their careers. They could potentially be prosecuted for doing so. So it's with incredible pride that I stand before you today, having gathered this incredible group. And I'm so glad that you all have joined us, because I think we really need to acknowledge just how lucky we are to be in a space and place like this where we can have precisely this type of challenging conversation. But going beyond even this, we know that there are a number of political candidates, particularly Republican political candidates, who are refusing to concede in the face of electoral defeat, and that there are well-trained and committed election officials who are resigning across the country in the face of horrifying threats and harassment. These are not partisan statements. This is reality. And yet, American journalists are struggling to cover this reality in a way that holds those actively undermining democracy to account. And so we're here today to think more about where we go from here. How can we support journalists and news managers who seek to responsibly report on the challenges facing American democracy? I'm thrilled to begin this conversation by welcoming Brian Stelter, a keen critical observer of American politics and American media. Brian is known for placing the most important and often most difficult issues at the center of his hosting and reporting. Brian, of course, is perhaps best known as the former chief media correspondent for CNN and host of the CNN program Reliable Sources. He's also worked as reporter and editor for a number of other outlets, including the New York Times. Brian is currently the Walter Shorenstein Media and Democracy Fellow at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Please join me in welcoming Brian.
Thank you very much. Hello. It's nice to be back in front of a microphone. It's been a little while, a little bit rusty, but I'll get settled in. Spilled Starbucks all over my laptop this morning, so I'm hoping that my speech stays intact for another half an hour before all the computer wires go haywire. I see myself as the pregame host here to set up a spicy panel conversation that's a few minutes away. But I want to thank Dr. Trumbull. I want to thank the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics for gathering us here today and giving us the space to have this important dialogue. As I alluded to, I've been off TV a couple months, so I'm a little getting my bearings, figuring out what's next. I no longer think in terms of daily newsletter leads or weekly TV show bookings. I've been freed up to think a little longer term and think a little bigger picture about media and democracy. And today's topic, media for democracy. You know, the midterms are right around the corner. The 2024 election is already, underway in the shadows. And at the same time, we are living with a zombie election, the election of 2020, a zombie because, well, Donald Trump refuses to let it die. I'm standing up here and thinking maybe I should be a zombie elector for Halloween. I think my kids will get a kick out of that. I remember using the phrase zombie election in November of 2020, a few weeks after then President Trump did the unthinkable and yet inevitable. And contested the results, well, not really contested, denied the results and exploited his own base for profit and power. He, of course, prepared for this in advance by telling his fans that Joe Biden could not win unless the Democrats cheated. So, of course, he prepared that storyline ahead of time. That smelly little lie is why the election was a test for America, a test that we, of course, passed. But it was more like a weekly quiz than a final, right? To put this here at GW, this period of turbulence, a war on the truth, this semester's worth of material is just getting going. And I think we all sense that, no matter our political leanings, that this period of turbulence is just beginning. It's far from over, which is why we need to have these dialogues in person and on TV and on podcasts and everywhere we possibly can. I'll never forget the Sunday morning of November 29th, which was 26 days after Election Day. This was 2020. It was the morning Trump broke his silence and gave his first TV interview since losing the election. Do you remember the game show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? You know, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? You get to have that phone a friend lifeline, right? If you're in real trouble, you could call a friend for help. Well, that's what Donald Trump did on the morning of November 29th. He phoned a friend. He phoned Maria Bartiromo, his friend at Fox News. And he called into Bartiromo's show, and he performed what Jonathan Rauch calls the firehood of falsehood approach. He repeated so many bogus claims, so many fantasies about election rigging and cheating. He was barely taking a breath, barely giving Bartiromo an opening to respond. And when Bartiromo did have a chance, when Trump did pause, Bartiromo encouraged him to keep going, keep lying, just keep doing it to the viewers, hurting those millions of viewers. Bartiromo didn't press for any evidence at all. She didn't stop and say, Mr. President, you're tearing a hole in the country. It's going to be very, very hard to repair. She said, this is disgusting, but she meant the imaginary voter fraud and not what the president was doing at the time. So at this point, some in the media were already using the words attempted coup to describe the situation. This was more than 3 weeks after Election Day. It was already clear he and his allies were trying to overturn the election. Some, not many, but some people could imagine it would lead to the violence at the Capitol, but we were still far from that point. It was still November. Some of Trump's Republican allies were joining him, trying to stall and stop and overturn the result. But on November 29th, to hear it straight from the president's mouth, to hear him making the case on Fox to millions of people that he won the election he lost, well, it was clear to me that I needed to rip up the rundown for reliable sources. My show was on at 11 a.m. Eastern. It was 10:30, and Trump was clearly here mounting a real fight to retain power. It was a fight he was destined to lose, and I think if you think back to November 2020, I think everybody felt that as well, that we knew he was going to lose this fight, this desperate attempt. But it was a real fight, and he was doing it. He was doing it on live TV, hurting Fox's viewers, and Fox was letting it happen. So we threw out the plan for the show. We threw out the rundown for the show, and we opened by saying that Trump was unable or unwilling to accept reality. We talked with Amanda Carpenter, since her book was titled Gaslighting America, and that's what was happening. We also talked with Jonathan Rauch, who I mentioned before, about the firehood of falsehood. Rauch said the method can be wild, it can be random. He said the goal is, quote, to create confusion and epistemic chaos. And that's what we are seeing right now. And, quote, it's very hard for democracies to deal with. So when I reread those words now, I think about power. I think about the power dynamics and the limits of power. I think about the line that was happening on the other channel and our attempts to rebut it to an almost entirely different audience. I think about the limits of power. I think it's important to recognize both the media's power in this conversation, but also the limits of that power. As Dr. Trumbull said in an interview once, democratic societies rely on well-informed citizens who understand the facts on the ground, who can make good decisions when they go to the ballot box. They need to know what's true, what's accurate. And that's exactly what newsrooms try to do. That's what we try to provide. Journalists do find the facts on the ground. Producers and editors package those facts and get them out to the public. That system works in thousands of small ways every single day. It's incredible. It's something we too often take for granted. And yet there are limits to that system and limits to that power. I do think through those actions, thousands of journalists every day showing up, doing the work, and then thousands of others packaging it and making sure it reaches millions of people, we, the collective we, are better informed as a result. But that's also where we can observe the limits of the media's power. News coverage does not elect or veto a candidate, nor should it, nor is it supposed to. News coverage of election workers being harassed does not necessarily put an end to that harassment. News coverage about election deniers being in line to oversee future elections does not stop the denialism. Sometimes covering a liar emboldens the liar. Sometimes pointing out the liar's lies helps the liar win more supporters. There are moments as a journalist where you might feel utterly powerless, except to write it all down, to make a record, to tell the viewers, to tell the listeners. So I just offer this as a little bit of a cautionary note that the power of the press is real and is profound, but is also limited. And observers on the sidelines who might shout and insist that the press can fix it, that the press alone can solve this democratic crisis, it's just not the way of the world. It's not the way it really works. Journalists have a role to play in this situation, but not the predominant role. Ultimately, we are reporting, we are writing, we are documenting for others then to take action or not. I guess I would put it this way. Reporters cannot just write their way out of this. Fact checkers can't fact check their way out of it. Anchors can't talk their way out of a democratic crisis. This is not like a movie or miniseries with a happy ending at the end of an hour or two. It's so much more complex. And indeed, there is a great debate to be had about whether journalists should seek to defend let me try it a different way. There's a great debate to be had about whether journalists should seek to defend a specific system of government at all, any specific system. I started to have this debate with a colleague last week. She said journalists advocating for democracy actually undermine democracy because they erode trust in the profession by putting a thumb on the scale for one system over another, or to be perceived as supporting one candidate over another. Obviously, part of the counter-argument is that journalists cannot thrive in a dictatorship. Journalism sustains democracies, and democracies sustain journalism. But as we hear and talk about the rise of the democracy beat, as newsrooms hire reporters to cover election denialism and the threats it poses in the future, as newsroom leaders say they are trying to raise the alarm and sound the alarm about democratic backsliding, let's make sure we note how it sounds to some voters, especially to a segment of the Trump base. I think we have to take note of the many Republican commentators who have mocked and ridiculed this very national conversation about threats to democracy. Some MAGA media stars say mail-in ballots are the real threat. Some of Fox's primetime players say that investigations into Trump's coup attempt are a total sham. Truth be told, they have a hard time keeping their stories straight. Was the violence on January 6th Nancy Pelosi's fault, or was it an Antifa plot, or was there not really violence at all? You know, these narratives, these stories they tell are often contradictory and nonsensical. In MAGA media, it's a climate of choose your own reality. Well, actually, no, it's a step beyond choose your own reality. It's now people can choose any and every unreality, combining multiple nonsensical, contradictory, conspiratorial stories. And look, none of this would matter that much in the grand scheme of history. Americans have always had a taste for conspiracy. Ask me later if I believe in UFOs, right? But it matters now because a former president and his media allies and millions of his supporters have insisted on making their unreality one of the major themes of this decade. It's 2022. I know we're going to be talking about this in 2029. Some version of this is still going to be in our politics. It's going to be with us for many, many years. And that's the part that should be reckoned with. That's the part of of media and democracy. After all, the pro-Trump media machine is a big part of the American media, and it's a force to be reckoned with. To minimize it is to miss a big part of the story. Now, I'm not saying that politicians who traffic in voter fraud conspiracy theories should be treated like normal, good faith actors, but we must document that it's happening and what's happening and show our work while we're at it. Newsrooms have to show how we reached our conclusions about what's true, and then show how propaganda outlets are trying to spin that truth away. We all see this on election nights, in the days ahead of an election, in the days after, whether it's a reporter standing in front of a big monitor showing the vote totals so you can actually see the numbers for yourself, or it's through explainers and Q&As about how projections are made. All of that kind of transparency is a way to win and regain trust, and that work is vital. You should also notice what news outlets don't bother doing that work, what media outlets don't bother showing that transparency or trying to educate the public about how the system actually works, but instead only try to fan flames of fear. But that work is critical. It's one of many pieces here. Even though the power of the press is limited, that's an important power, an important role, and will be for many years to come. On my final edition of Reliable Sources, I made a comment that we must make sure we don't give platforms to those who are lying to our faces. But I said we also must make sure we're representing the full spectrum of debate and representing what's going on in the country and why people are reaching the beliefs and conclusions that they are reaching. After all, according to 538, quoting here, almost 200 Republicans on the ballot this November do not believe that President Biden legitimately won his office. And as we know, some of those election deniers could influence future elections if they win. I think we can also confidently predict that some of them will dispute the results if they lose. So we're going to be in for many more zombie elections in our future. And that's why I say this is going to go on for many years. We should expect we're only at the beginning. That's why if I were making a list of challenges for the American news media in this decade, covering zombie elections would be high on the list. It takes care and research and number crunching. You've got to have those graphics and those monitors and those Q&As to show how the work is done, how the results are found, how they're double and triple checked. News outlets have to do whatever they can do to restore trust in those systems while also scrutinizing them when appropriate. But it's not just about number crunching, it's about a lot more than data. To cover elections in the middle of democratic crisis really means to cover the voters, to cover the people making the decisions. And again, what led to certain beliefs, show that work as well. I recently interviewed Todd Rose, who's the author of a book called Collective Illusions, about groupthink and social pressure. His think tank Populous has done fascinating work on private opinion polling. So he looks for the difference between what people will publicly say and what they actually believe in private. There are ways to poll this, to find out what people will tell a pollster because they feel like it's a public answer versus what they actually privately think but might not want to admit. And in short, Americans share a lot more common ground than they think they do. A lot more common ground. And most Republicans who publicly say the election was stolen from Trump actually privately admit he lost. Most who claim he won actually know the truth. They're giving what they perceive to be the right answer to a pollster in public. Yes, the election was stolen. That's what they think they're supposed to say, in the same way Democrats think they are supposed to say that the election rigging is total craziness. But they just give what they perceive to be the right answer due to peer pressure. That gap between what people say in public and say in private is part of the democracy beat story. This is about belief and what people will claim and then how those beliefs will be used. I think it's another area where the reality-based news media can rise to the occasion, not just through the data and the transparency, but through the human stories of why people vote the way they do and what they consume along the way. The way I see it, the battle for democracy is also a battle for attention. It's not unlike TikTok and Instagram in this way. Apps trade on attention, advertisers trade on attention, and it's a key part of politics too. The anti-democracy wing of the GOP is very good at gaining attention, including through the media. Newsrooms and magazines and TV shows and websites with finite resources have to decide every minute of every day where to focus that attention. And I know I've screwed up at this at various times in my career with how I've spent my time, where I've focused my attention, where I've spent my minutes on TV. The good news is the work is never over. The work is never over. Every day, when you're a member of the media, and we all are now because we all have phones in our pocket, every day is an opportunity to get it right, to do it differently, to do it better. And especially for professional journalists, every day is a chance to either lose a little bit more of the public's trust or to win a little bit of it back. I never buy into the studies that show no one trusts the media. Everyone trusts some media. It's just that people trust different forms of media, and we are incredibly fragmented in that regard. But every day is a chance to win a little bit of that trust back through the transparency angles that I was mentioning, through reporting on voters and not just the vote count. Ultimately, as Dr. Trumbull said, this is about trust. Trust is a key factor in this conversation. Edward Luce of the Financial Times wrote about this right on the eve of the 2020 election. He said, it's a bad sign for democracy when trust is gone. He said, fear is the glue of autocracy, and trust is the lubricant of democracy. We need that trust in each other, in our institutions, in our media outlets. But when I was thinking about his quote recently, when I was rereading it, I was thinking, a word like autocracy even, how many Americans really understand what that reference is and what life under autocracy actually represents and looks like? How many stories do journalists, and I count myself in this camp, how many stories have we told that start at the middle, not the beginning? We go on television, we talk about creeping autocracy, creeping authoritarianism, democratic backsliding. I've tried to learn from my political scientists' idols on these topics, and yet I fear that I was starting the story in the middle and not at the beginning by defining the terms and giving examples and going into detail and showing people what it actually means. So that's why it brings me to this next point about how we can tap into those resources that we in the media, that newsrooms, media outlets need to tap into political scientists and other resources, but help translate that material for the wider public. One of my favorite scholars studying rhetoric and democracy, Jennifer Mercy at Texas A&M, says we live in an age of frame warfare. Frame warfare. She says, quote, every day our political discourse is dominated by an agenda-setting war about what issues we should talk about, and then a frame war, how we should frame and understand those issues. And right now, she says, both sides are framing what they are doing as defending democracy. And I think that's important to keep in mind, especially when you hear Republicans about defending democracy. So I think we need those sorts of experts. We need rhetoric professors and political scientists and researchers to be front and center in media coverage of politics. This is another area where I think in the limited power the press has, we can use that power to bring in expert outside voices and make sure they are heard loud and clear so that we have the tool, we have the language that we need to talk about these issues. And then to get back to my prior point, it's important for journalists to start the story at the beginning, not at the middle or the end, and to help start at the 101 level. But by all means, newsrooms have a media literacy function to teach folks about something like frame warfare, to show how it's happening and who's benefiting, so that people are equipped to see these political maneuverings for what they are. We also need many different kinds of newsrooms to be covering this subject, many different kinds, to be creating a historical record of threats against democracy and responses by the public. Again, that's the power the press does have, to create that record. We need different kinds of newsrooms doing it. We need local and global newsrooms. We need ad-supported and subscriber-supported newsrooms. We need commercial and not-for-profit, and so forth and so forth. In the book Democracy Without Journalism, Victor Pickard argues that sustaining U.S. democracy requires we fund an alternative media infrastructure, one insulated from the commercial pressures that ushered in the current journalism crisis. Now, I recognize the budget for PBS is not going to be tripled tomorrow, and many conservatives say it should be zeroed out altogether. But nurturing and supporting a wide array of news outlets helps to ensure a healthier ecosystem for all of us. The relative health of the media ecosystem is really, in fact, a part of the democracy beat. To understand voters, to understand candidates, to understand presidents, just look at their media diets. Look at what they're consuming. Everything flows from those sources of information. For a while, I felt like I was a specialist in Trump's media diet. I was like analyzing everything he ate. And after he lost in 2020, he ate a feedback loop of fictions. His favorite TV shows told him he was a victim of a massive crime. Then he tweeted all about what he heard on TV, and then they repeated it on TV. It's hard to understand what that's like if you haven't worked in television. That feedback loop, but in this case, it was a fiction. He would tweet about it, and then he would play clips from those shows at his rallies, and then he would repeat the lies he saw on those shows. There was an example that was so ridiculous that I had to document it in December of 2020, a week after the Bartiromo interview. One American News ran a short segment claiming that only 1,000 people had watched a Biden speech on the web. And as Biden might say, like, come on, man, right? Like you really think only 1,000 people, and no matter how boring the speech, you think 1,000 people watched it on the web. Like it was obvious foolishness. Dozens of websites showed the speech on the web, millions of people watched it. But this fake segment on OAN was based on a single random tweet by some Biden hater who wanted it to be true. So Trump saw it, he loved it, he heard about this on OAN, he gorged on the lie, he tweeted about the lie. It was like another crowd-sized debacle. And he even brought it up on stage at a rally, and he used it to cast doubt on Biden's win. He said, how do you have 80 million votes and you only have 1,000 people? Which, look, that's the kind of illogic that would get you kicked out of GW. But this is the poisoned information climate that we are all still living in. Some people don't want it to be true. It's true. This is the poisoned information climate. A now former president misinformed by some random tweet, who then went and misinformed millions of people based on it. And I say we're all living in it because the entire political discourse is affected, which is why, in response, some people say, don't cover Trump, don't talk about him, don't even bother fact-checking it anymore. Maggie Haberman responded to that actually earlier today. She's on a book tour for her new book, Confidence Man, and she said, look, he's a former president with a huge following, and he undermines faith in elections and embraces conspiracy theories. Quote, I'm not sure there's a good argument for ignoring him, because he still gets heard through other means. She said there is a good argument for contextualizing him. And I thought it was an interesting, notable distinction between covering and contextualizing. There's a lot of covering that happens, and covering the news. For journalists, the basic fundamental job, the function is go cover the news. Figure out what that politician said, come back and tell us. But contextualizing, that's often what matters most. Contextualizing campaigns and elections is what this democracy needs. So we need to make sure we can see the differences within the media as this democracy beat becomes a really vital part of the news business. We need to distinguish between the people who go out and gather the information, that fact-checking, that gathering that happens, versus the commentary that happens all around it. And look, I recognize I was on a television program where we were doing both functions in the same hour, sometimes in the same minute. But it's important to recognize the distinctions between those. I'm standing on the old Crossfire set. This used to be the stage for Crossfire on CNN. This was where Jon Stewart famously told Tucker Carlson that you're hurting America. And that was nearly 20 years ago. And yet that introspection, although Stewart was doing it in a fiery and lively and humorous way, needs to continue to happen for the press, by the press, and to the press. Earlier, I said the power of the press is limited. I think it is limited, but it's clearly still consequential. And I hope I've outlined some of the ways to use that power, to effectively use the power of the press to ensure that the truth, as best we can find it, is reaching people, a wide array of people. When I signed off from Reliable Sources in August, I said we're living through this era of absolutely dizzying change. Some folks in this room are probably too young to even perceive how dizzying it's been. I'm what am I? I'm in my 30s, so I can at least remember pre-iPhone, pre-Facebook. But we all now have these supercomputers in our pockets. We are all now members of the media. And frankly, there's so much we don't know about the effects of all this new tech. and the way that information and disinformation, especially, is distorting our public debate, making it harder to hear each other, even though, as that populist study finds, we have a lot of common ground. A lot of common ground that we can barely even see over all the yelling. I hear yelling, okay. But I said on the air, my final program, I said, what I do know, there's a lot we don't know. I said, what I do know is it's not partisan to stand up for decency and democracy and dialogue. It's not partisan to stand up to demagogues. It's patriotic to do so. And that's why the American news media needs to be strong, needs to remain strong, needs to be held accountable. I frankly think it's up to you and you and you. I think it's up to all of you and me. I think it's up to all of us to play a part in that, to hold the media accountable for democracy, and to hold all those other players, the other stakeholders, the ones, frankly, with more power, the candidates and politicians and elected officials and institutions, to hold them accountable. But because we are now all members of the media, we all do have some of that power. And I hope most of us can use that power to help make it better. So, like I said, I think I'm the pregame show. Now to the fun part. Dr. Trumbull's going to come back up and introduce our panel, and that's when it gets really good. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Brian. You weren't with us this morning as a number of journalists and scholars gathered together to talk about this theme and how we might support journalists, newsrooms, media organizations going forward, but you might as well have been because you genuinely covered so many of the topics and the themes that we addressed this morning and that we were really struggling with and that we will, after this public event, go back and reflect on and continue to struggle with. This is not an easy set of issues. The complexities here are immense. And I'm particularly struck by your note that it is not just up to media. It is up to all of us, everyone in this room and beyond, to take these issues seriously. And I'm particularly happy to see as I look out in the room here that there are a number of young faces, a number of our students, particularly from the School of Media and Public Affairs. You are the future of this absolutely vital work. And getting to see your enthusiasm in our classrooms, the fact that you show interest and even turn out to these events when, let me tell you, it's hard to get people to come out in person to events after all of this time. It genuinely leaves me with a sense of hope and optimism. It's a tough time. It's a dark time in many ways. But Brian, many of the things that you said, I think, help us point to the way forward. Now we'll be able to continue the discussion. I'm really thrilled to welcome our 4 excellent panelists, an incredible moderator. I'd like to invite you to come up to the stage, and once you're seated, I will introduce each of you to our audience. I really, truly could not be more thrilled to have this excellent set of journalists and scholars joining us here today. This is pretty close to my dream team superhero Avengers group that you can imagine. Serving as moderator, Jesse Holland is a colleague, an assistant professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs here at GW. He is an award-winning journalist and has won multiple awards for his fiction and nonfiction writing, including The Invisibles, The Untold Story of African-American Slavery in the White House. Professor Holland also serves as a guest host on C-SPAN's Washington Journal, and he's a great colleague and an inspiration to our students. So thank you, Jesse, for agreeing to serve as moderator for today's discussion. Yes, please. To Jesse's left is Lilliana Mason, who is an associate research professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University's SNF Agora Institute and Department of Political Science. That is one heck of a mouthful. I don't know how you say it on a regular basis. She is author of 2 highly influential books that have helped lay the groundwork for today's discussion. Those are Uncivil Agreement, How Politics Became Our Identity, and Radical American Partisanship, Mapping Violent Hostility, Its Causes and Consequences for Democracy. Thank you, Lily, for joining us. Next, we have Denetra Walker. Dr. Walker is an award-winning television news journalist and journalism scholar at the University of Georgia who focuses on race and media. Mainly through qualitative methods, her work captures the experiences of marginalized and underrepresented journalists in the digital age. She covers social justice, activism, police shootings, maternal health, and has a growing interest in racialized mis- and disinformation. Denetra is truly one of the up-and-coming young stars in our field, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have her here. I turn then to dear friend and colleague Dannagal Young. Professor Young is a professor of communication and political science at the University of Delaware, where she studies the content, audience, and effects of non-traditional political information. Her book, Irony and Outrage, examines satire and outrage as the logical extensions of the respective psychological profiles of liberals and conservatives. Her current book project, Wrong, How Identity Fuels Misinformation and How to Fix It, looks at how our mediated political world fuels asymmetric wrongness. Dana is absolutely powerhouse in this space, who is, I know, an incredible inspiration to many of us, and for the students in SMPA, you won't get through the program without reading her work. So, Dana, thank you for joining us. And last, but certainly not least, we're joined by Molly Ball, who is an American political journalist and writer. She's the national political correspondent for Time magazine. And previously, she covered US politics for The Atlantic, where she won the 2012 Toner Prize for Excellence in Public Reporting for her coverage of the 2012 United States elections. In 2019, she received the Gerald R. Ford Prize for Distinguished Reporting on the Presidency for her coverage of the Trump administration. And Molly's reporting is, I think, among the best in this field, particularly in her coverage of the presidency. I've long been an admirer and am doing a little bit of fangirling here, standing to her left. So please help me welcome Molly and together this incredible panel. Jesse, I turn it over to you.
Well, first I want to welcome all of you here for this important conversation. And we also want to say a thank you to Brian for that great keynote that brought up many of the topics we're going to talk about here today. But we also want to say thank you to Rebecca for putting all of this together. We wouldn't be here without her. First and foremost, I don't want to make the mistake that Brian just talked about and start in the middle of the conversation instead of starting at the beginning. So I'm going to start with the question that has us all here and get each one of our panelists to actually answer it. I mean, in the United States, we've been through so much. We've been through 2 wars with Britain, war with Spain, Whiskey Rebellion, the attack on Congress in Philadelphia, civil rights movement, Jim Crow, all the way down to January 6th. So why is democracy in a crisis now? Why do we actually think democracy is in a crisis? And I'll start with you, Lily. Is democracy in a crisis?
Yeah. I think one way to think about it is to go back to the 1960s, which was a time of real social upheaval, and there were protests and there were actual political assassinations. I mean, it was a really chaotic time. But the important thing about that period of time is that the parties, our political parties, were not on opposing sides of that chaos. And so as a government, as a two-party system, we could have chaos in our society, but the parties weren't organized around it. And after the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, we started to see a lot of very disaffected white Southern Democrats who didn't really like the Democratic Party anymore. And the Republican Party took advantage of this and gradually over decades brought them into the Republican Party. They also took advantage of an emerging Christian right movement that had previously been non-political and was becoming political. To the extent that now what we're seeing is the Republican Party embodying largely, white, Christian, rural, traditional American values, and the Democratic Party, having to be everyone else. And in fact, the Democratic Party being the only party really pushing for a much more multi-ethnic democracy, pluralistic democracy. And so the chaos that we're seeing now is organized by our politics. The parties, when we vote, we're voting for an image of America that looks like it did in the 1950s versus an image of America that we've never truly really seen before, that's even more, more representative and more equal. So the danger to democracy comes from that. When we're voting, we're not just voting on tax policy, we're voting on what does America look like and what will it look like in the future. And those are the types of arguments that we can't compromise on. And that creates a place of real stoppage in our politics.
Denetra, are we in crisis right now, given everything that we've been through?
Yeah, so I would definitely agree, and I'm gonna, just kind of talk about a lot of the conversation goes with power. So even when we didn't even realize that democracy was in crisis, it was, and for whom, right? There's a power dynamic. So even when we're talking about journalism and how it's, the first, we're talking about how journalism started and how people were reporting on certain things. What were they reporting on? Who was in the newsrooms? Where was the power, right? And so when we talk about it now, it still exists, but at the same time, it's almost like we're not just talking about the people who don't have power anymore. Now they have voices. And we're looking at the changing dynamics of society. But, at the end of the day, yes, it is in crisis. And I think it's more salient now because we have social media and we're talking about it more. And I think a lot of people weren't talking about these things. It was not something that you would say. And our country is very young, whether we admit it or not. And at the end of the day, when we talk about all of these different dynamics that come into play, it has always existed, and I think now people are starting to feel more empowered to say it. At the same time, some people have been more empowered to voice their views. And so journalists are trying to cover these different topics, and at the end of the day, it's like, how do you cover them? So yes, it has always existed, and in my honest opinion, it will always exist, unfortunately, because the more you take power away from someone, and we've been having these conversations, the more they're going to fight to keep it. And so our democracy is really at a place where we're trying to figure out what's the next step. None of us have the answer. And so now we're sitting up here, and there's a lot of really smart people, really trying to find answers to how we can all move forward, like a kumbaya moment. But at the end of the day, we have all these different things that are happening, all these different points of views, and a changing dynamic with our demographics. And yes, it's going to continue to be in crisis for a long time until we all, or to a great majority, admits it. And then we can start to think about moving forward.
Dana?
So I'm going to do what I usually do, which is take what Lily's already said and then build on that. So Lily's work on the social sorting of our political parties over time, I think, has been so hugely influential in our field because it helps us understand political discourse right now in terms of identity and the increasing importance of social identity. That it's not just that we're voting for a particular slate of issue positions and policy positions, but that our political party has become this sort of proxy, this umbrella that encompasses how we worship, what we look like, where we live, how we spend our free time, and what our fundamental values are. And so that has created an America of today that has a problem of political sectarianism. And the way that I approach this as a communication person is from the standpoint of how our media and social media economics and logics are tailor-made for the kind of fragmentation that political sectarianism offers. Because our media organizations, cable news, social media algorithms, Facebook pages and groups, all of these things make such efficient use of our multi-layered political identities in ways that just distill those identities. And we're reminded all the time of who we are, how we think, how people like me behave, and how we talk, and how we outgroup other people. And that distillation process is exacerbated in a way that I don't think that we have seen. And so I'm not putting all of those eggs in media's basket, but there's a synergy that's happening that is particularly destructive right now.
Molly.
Hi. Well, like most things, like most issues, I think as a reporter, it's important to me to be somewhat agnostic on this question, and to consult experts like you all to weigh in on this question of whether there's a crisis in democracy. I think worldwide, it's clear that there is what's been called a democratic recession, right? If you look at the Freedom House rankings of governments around the world and how many of them are to some degree democratic or not, that's a number that's been going down for many years, and I think that's a big problem. Do we have a crisis in democracy in the United States? I think we need to think about what we mean when we're asking that question. And, you know, it is not a crisis for democracy that Donald Trump won an election, and it is not a crisis for democracy that Donald Trump lost an election. And I think when a lot of people in polls answer that question, that's what they mean, right? I think for a lot of liberals, it was a crisis for democracy, just that Trump could get elected and be president. And for a lot of Republicans today, it is a crisis for democracy that they believe the election was stolen, which obviously is not true. So whether our democracy is functioning, to me, is a question of, first of all, do we have a representative government in which people can choose their leaders? And so far, that's working out okay. It obviously got a little bit hairy on January 6th. But the system held, the institutions held, and we do have a system of representative government where most people still go and vote and believe that that vote counts and believes that the person who wins the election is the one who got elected. And then I think the other question about whether we have a democracy is our political system successful at mediating our national disputes in a way that they do not degenerate into violent conflict? And there, I think there's reason to worry because we did just for the first time in American history not have a peaceful transfer of power. We had a transfer of power, but it wasn't peaceful. And there's a lot of warning signs about whether Americans are willing to continue to use the democratic process to mediate their disputes, or whether they believe that the situation is too desperate and they have to take up arms. That's really scary. That would be but I do think it's important to keep this all in perspective. I find some of the commentary about this a bit hysterical because, arguably we didn't have a democracy in this country until the Civil Rights Act, right? And so people's ability to vote, universal suffrage, people's ability to have a voice in their government, it is easier to vote and harder to cheat in almost every state in the country, despite some of the legislation that has been proposed in some states in recent years. It is easier for people to have a voice in their government than it has ever been. So, all of this is relative.
I'll stick with you with this question, Molly. Given what happened on January 6th, like you said, we had for the first time a non-peaceful transfer of power. And now we're coming up on midterm elections and a presidential election, which will start the day after the midterm elections. Should journalism change how we have covered democracy and elections and voters based on what we saw on January 6th? What should we change? And if we should change, how should we change?
Well, I'm again going to say yes and no. But look, on the one hand, yes, anytime the political landscape changes, we should adapt to that. And this is a new sort of issue set that you see a lot of newsrooms adapting to, right? A lot more coverage of things like voting rights, a lot more coverage of things like violent right-wing extremism and the potential threat that it poses, a lot of coverage about things like disinformation and radicalization and all of the trends that we see. So I think that there's a natural and a good tendency in the media when something happens to then continue to try to explain to people or figure out for people what caused it and whether it's continuing as a problem. But does that mean we should, change our whole approach to the exclusion of everything else, and it should be the only question that we ask, candidates or voters, and every story we write about the midterms should only be about, whether this candidate denies the election, blah, blah, blah. No, I don't think we should do that. Most people see their vote in the midterms as a vote about the future, and I think that's up to them. It's their vote, and they should use it how they see fit. So, if the majority, I was just in Georgia where Trump tried very hard to take out the governor and the secretary of state for not going along with his attempt to overturn the election. And they, sort of kept their heads down, went out to that same Republican electorate that thinks the election is stolen and convinced them that other things were more important. So I think it's our job to cover the elections that are actually happening, in which that may not be people's highest priority, whether the last election was stolen, and portray for our readers what it is that people do care about and what it is that actually the election is turning on.
Dana, what do you think?
So my sense is that I'm going to answer this a little bit differently because I feel like there are things that have become sort of staples of election reporting over the last 30 years that my field has been complaining about during that entire time, that have catastrophic implications now, far greater than 30 years ago. So the big one that everyone has heard me talk about forever, along with Tom Patterson since 1992, horse race framing and strategy framing and reporting. So that is coverage of elections in terms of who's ahead and who's behind, public opinion polls, talking about campaign choices in terms of, this candidate visited this group of people because, it is a strategy to try to, get the vote up with soccer moms in, the suburbs of Philadelphia, blah, blah, blah. So now that's always been something that we have known is probably problematic. And there's empirical evidence suggesting that that enhances political cynicism. It causes people to think about politics in terms of strategy, and no one is actually doing anything because they think it's the right policy. They're just doing it to try to get a vote. It also has been shown to, in some circumstances, reduce turnout and reduce trust in government. All of those things are bad. Now, I would say they're even worse. Because if you are talking about strategy, horse race, or also called game framing, now you're also running the risk of emboldening and legitimizing authoritarian populist candidates. Why do I say that? Because a strategy framing and reporting treats candidates as personalities. It is the spectacle of the race. It doesn't actually deal with issue positions or policy platforms or evaluate how feasible some of their ideas are. It really is just about the personalities. And so if you happen to be a candidate that does not have a platform, hypothetically, then you are going to benefit disproportionately from reporting that's going to talk about, you perhaps being an underdog, et cetera. So I feel like the cost of the strategy horse race frame is greater than it's ever been. So all of that is to say, yeah, I do think that journalists should do things a little bit differently right now, but they probably should have been doing that differently 30 years ago too.
Denetra.
So I'll say this. And we've had these conversations about when a person's under deadline, they're not thinking, I'm using this frame and I'm using that frame, right? You know, like, so let's be honest, like I never thought about that. And most of these conversations, at least in this tone, I didn't really hear from this angle until I got here. And when I say got here, I mean became an academic, right, scholar. So one of the things that I think about when I think about should we do things different, the answer is of course, but it's how. So I think of strategy. So when we're thinking about how we should reframe, not just reframe the way journalists do their work, we should also think about how to tell them to do their work in a way that's not extremely disruptive to their newsroom structure. We know the newsrooms are shrinking, if I can get the words out. We know that journalists come from different backgrounds all around the country, in different newsrooms that have different points that they like to put out. But at the end of the day, how do we have a one-size-fits-all message to journalists of how they should cover elections? We have a lot of unprecedented things that are happening. So now, what are we doing to not just talk about this, but to get the message out to journalists in a way that they can easily digest it, as well as do better? Because we talk about accountability. Yes, we definitely want to be accountable to not making sure that this person is, you know, the horse race frame, right? This person is ahead. Well, that's easy. You know, I worked in television. It's real easy, and I'm not, you know, making an excuse for it, but it's real easy to put this on. It's the easily digestible information to hurry up and put on, as well as a poll. But we can and we should do better. And I think that comes with guidance from some really smart people, as well as the input from journalists, as well as in our schools when we're talking about training people who are media makers, because we all are media makers, to Brian's point, but also how we can move forward with this with everyone being on the same page, which is things need to change, so let's talk about how to change it.
Lily.
So I think that there's a problem that's common to journalism and American political science, which is this norm of nonpartisanship that is drilled into us for years and years of training. We are trained not to prefer one party, not to ever publish anything that suggests that one party is better somehow than the other. And for a long time, it was possible for us, I'm speaking now of political scientists, but this also applies to journalists, it was possible for us to be three things: truthful, nonpartisan, and pro-democracy. And we are supposed to be all three of those things. What happened, particularly during the Trump administration, is that we could no longer be all three at once. And a lot of, at least political scientists, felt like we were now having to choose between being nonpartisan and being pro-democracy or truthful. And so lectures that I had given 10 years before that had not come across as partisan at all, during the Trump administration all of a sudden sounded partisan because I was talking about the importance of a free media, for example. And so changing norms is a really hard thing to do, and it's happening very slowly in political science. It will be hard for it to happen in journalism, but at some point we have to be able to say, when we are truthfully talking about what's happening in the country, that on some things you have to take a side. Not necessarily a partisan side, but we were talking earlier, after January 6th, all of the media agreed. That was bad, right? All of the media that we were reading said that was a bad thing.
Not all.
No, sorry.
I was going to jump in there as
not
well.
The right wing, not right wing.
In the immediate seconds after January 6th, everyone said it was bad.
That day.
The day after, the story changed.
Because it was Antifa.
For some media.
Yeah, right. But taking a stand to say January 6th was undesirable and anti-democratic is an important thing for the media to be able to do. And something, as we were discussing earlier, the question becomes then, what other things are so important that journalists would take a side on them? right? If we're talking about taking voting rights away from women, for example, right? Do they take a side on something like that? Not because they're Democrats or Republicans, but because we're talking about losing actual rights in our democracy. And so it's a really tough question. It will require probably years of training and thinking about how we train journalists and political scientists. But I think that the norms of nonpartisanship were built for a different time when our parties were basically equally committed to democracy, and we're just not at that point anymore.
I had all of these great questions I was going to ask, but then Brian gave his keynote, so I'm going to steal his questions and ask the panel. But I also want to say that I've learned as a journalist, we don't always know the right questions to ask, and there's always someone who can ask a better question. I'm saying all of this to say there's going to be a microphone out there somewhere. If you have a question you want to ask this panel, there's going to be a microphone going on, and I'm going to leave time near the end for you to be able to ask your question. Because once again, I've learned that we as journalists don't always ask the right questions or know the right questions to ask. So I want to make sure that you have a chance to talk to our panel and ask a better question than perhaps what I would have. But once again, I'm stealing this question directly from Brian's keynote. As Americans, our job is to defend our democracy. Is that our job as journalists? To actually say, this is bad for democracy. This is good for democracy. Isn't it our job as journalists to be neutral observers? Can we be neutral observers when it comes to whether our government is in crisis or not? And I'll start with you first, Molly, because I know you're going to say yes and no. So I'll give you a chance to jump. I'll give you a chance to say that first, because that's how I would have answered it as a journalist as well.
Well, my question is why? What is the point of having individual reporters standing out there saying, oh, by the way, this is bad? Like, why do we need that? Because I think, you know, most people reading the news since Donald Trump started running for president would not think that the worst problem in the media is that they weren't hard enough on him, you know, that we weren't hard enough on him. I think it was very clear to most voters that here was someone who, you know, had a difficult relationship with the truth and did a whole lot of precedent-shattering things and was not necessarily invested in a lot of our institutions, including the institutions of democratic governance. So the idea that we somehow needed more, you know, sort of finger-pointing from the media to inform people that, by the way, this is bad, I just am not sure how that would have helped. And again, it's not a problem for democracy that Donald Trump won an election. And I do feel like there is an undercurrent of a lot of this coverage that feels like, well, the media failed because people voted for Trump. And I don't believe that at all. People can vote for whoever they want. It's our job to inform them. And if they decide that knowing all of these things, and you know, the majority of people when they went to the polls in 2016 believed that Donald Trump lied a lot, including a lot of his voters. And they decided that, you know, they still wanted to vote for him. And that is, and you know, it's never our job, in my view, I mean, for opinion journalists perhaps, but for straight reporters, it's not our job to tell people who we think they should vote for. It's to give them the information that would help them make an informed choice according to their priorities, which are up to them. We don't get to set their priorities. We don't get to say to voters, you're supposed to care about this other thing more than the thing that you think you care about.
Anyone want to jump in on? Oh,
So I don't know that I don't know that a sort of pro-democracy frame would necessarily say reporters weren't hard enough on Trump. I don't think that that's what it would be. I think it would be that we need to think about the implicit frames that are present that might reward candidates like Trump. Meaning, you know, whether it be the strategy frame or a focus on the spectacle and the rallies and these kinds of habits that are not, it's not, do you know what I'm saying? The difference between saying like, yeah, Trump lied, Trump is bad for all these reasons, versus just paying more attention. Because I'll tell you what, one of the things that I feel like I would love for journalists to recognize is the notion that a lot of times attacks on the press and attacks on their institution are rewarded with more press and more attention. Things like that, where it's like, it's not about like calling it out and being like, this is anti-democratic and bad all the time. It's that there are certain practices that I think largely because of media economics end up rewarded that actually are bad for democracy.
Sure. I mean, I think when it comes to the horse race thing, I have yet to see any election or media outlet that only covers who's up and who's down and doesn't ever mention people's issue positions. That's a straw man. But it is our job to satisfy readers' curiosity. And the number one thing anybody wants to know about any election is who's going to win. And so we are trying to survey the available evidence and give people a sense of as best we can know because, and I think it's important that we always couch this in a fundamental humility. People get mad at us for not predicting the future as if you don't know that it hasn't happened yet. We're not clairvoyant, right? We don't have some kind of crystal ball that regular people don't. And so I think it's important to always remind people that the future hasn't happened yet and this is just, hunches or evidence or people's guesses and predictions, speculation basically. But people want to know who's going to win. And so, people hate polls, but it's a whole lot better than like wandering into the, King Soopers down the street and asking 5 people and saying, okay, well, they all said they're going to vote for so-and-so, right? It's just a way of talking to more people to get more evidence to answer the questions that our readers are curious about. So should we only cover elections that way? Of course not. But I don't think that means we should not talk about those things.
So I'll say something. When we're talking about a journalist's position with democracy, I think that when we talk about advocacy, I think that journalists are advocates for the truth. They have always been watchdogs. If you ask a journalist, I've done work where you ask a journalist what they do, what they believe, they will say, truth to power, we're watchdogs for the truth. We are advocates for, they won't use the word advocates, but they want to get the truth out, right? Advocates for truth. But if you ask someone, are you pro-democratic? They're going to say, democracy, right? Excuse me, pro-democracy. They're going to say, well, what do you mean? Because now we're thinking about politics. And one of the first things you want to do as a journalist is stay as far away from politics in the sense of your position as possible, right? Because we're supposed to be what? The big O, objective, right? We're supposed to be unbiased viewers of the world. We're supposed to put this information out, like even you said it, Molly, put the information out and then let them decide. But I think that when it comes to what we do as journalists, it is okay, and I mean this, it is okay to say I'm an advocate for the truth. And that means that if something is in truth, I may not have to show the other side. And what I mean by that is if something is a fact, which is President Biden won the electorate, right? And he is the president of the United States, which we can break that down to so many different local levels, different races and different stories. There is no other side to saying he won the election. That is a fact. So when you're talking about, taking a position, that's not taking a position. That is a fact. Do we need to hear from people who don't believe that's true? And the same thing with COVID. You have COVID deniers, especially in the beginning when we were all learning so much about this virus. Do we need to hear, if we have health experts saying something, as a journalist, do I need to get the other side from people who don't believe it's true? And I think when we're talking about, politics, I think people get so wrapped up in feeling as if they will look like they are having a position rather than being an advocate or a watchdog for truth and power. And I think if we kind of not just frame it, but if we explain it to people in such a way, then maybe they will be able to receive it a little bit better.
Lily?
Yeah, I mean, I think, honestly, the horse race coverage is sort of least harmful when it comes to election outcomes, right? Because that's what's happening. There's an actual election. But often we see this, big win for Democrats, this legislation passed, right? Mm-hmm. Rather than big win for, these people who are going to get benefits from this legislation, and here are the details, and nobody wants to read the details. But the thing about winning and losing is that it taps into such a deep psychological place in people because we just want to be winners, right? We really don't want to be losers. And the fact that all of these identities are now aligned with our partisanship means that when our party is a loser, we feel like a loser in so many different parts of ourselves. It's connected to our racial identity, it's connected to our religious identity, it's connected to all these parts of who I think I am and my status in the world. All just because my party's losing on the legislation was my party lost. So in that sense, I think the horse race coverage can be really complicating. And one way that I would think about it is to think about journalism more as education and helping citizens understand what's happening in their government and understand what's coming, right? So this coming election there's going to be hundreds of different elections happening all over the place. Each one of them could be contested in each state, right? We could have secretaries of state disagreeing with governors, but they're both up for election, and there could be chaos. There could be like a lot of chaos in next month. And it would be really great if we had trusted journalists saying, okay, this is the schedule. This is what's going to happen. These are when the votes are going to come in. This is how long you're going to have to wait before you can be certain, so that the conspiracy theories don't proliferate immediately after the elections, and to sort of help the electorate. And I think they did a really good job of this in 2020. Help the electorate understand what's coming and try to sort of inoculate people from the possibility of conspiracy theorizing about elections being stolen and rejecting any elections that particularly the Republican Party loses. And so I think that thinking of it as an educator role, more than just a let's give them what they want to hear, could be a more not responsible, but sort of more productive way of engaging in particularly political news.
A lot of what we've been talking about so far has been about the past. But as you just said, Lily, we have a major election coming up in just about a month and another presidential election coming up in about 2 years. What do we do as journalists? What should journalists do to make sure, or is it our job to make sure that the democratic systems still work? You were just talking about an educational function for journalism. What should we be doing in the field of journalism to make sure that our readers, viewers, and listeners are getting the information they need to make their minds up, and yet not falling into the trap of reporting every election conspiracy theory, reporting on people, as Brian say, giving platform to people who are lying directly to our faces? How do we walk that line? And Denetra, I'll start with you on that one. How do we walk the line between doing our job as journalists and doing our job as American citizens who want to see our democracy continue?
Well, I would say, first, I want to throw this in. The last couple of years have been extremely tough for journalists, and I want to say that it needs to be said.
Amen.
They are constantly being harassed in Trump rallies. They don't want to go. They feel unsafe, and definitely if it's a woman or if it's a person of color, they don't want to be near the story a lot of times because they are being harassed and they are being threatened and they're being sometimes even physically assaulted. With that said, when we're thinking about moving forward and having them cover this work, I would say, first of all, we have to think about their safety. I think that's important. Because when we're sending people out to these stories, sometimes they're even a one-man band or a one-woman band, which means it's just one person with a camera doing the work with all these people around them. So we have to be conscious of how we're sending people out. I think it's very important. But also being able to explain, having them be able to explain what is happening. Everyone does not get this training that you all are getting, or that your classrooms are getting, which means if they're going out and they're talking about the democratic process, they don't even know how to break it down. And that doesn't mean a person is not intelligent. Of course they are. It just means how to be able to explain and properly report on certain things. And I think that's a huge hole that's not just in newsrooms. Again, I think that's just something that's happening across the board. And then you had another point that I wanted to touch on. I wanted to, as part of your question.
Yeah, what do we do as journalists moving forward covering these next two elections? Is it our job as journalists to provide information to the voters? Is it our job as journalists to ignore the people who are lying directly to our faces?
Yeah, I wanted to make sure I was getting all your questions. I was like, because I feel like I had a certain part. But yes, it is their job. It is our job as journalists to tell the truth, right? But also to be thoughtful in how we're covering it. I think every detail, as we've discussed here, does not have to be a part of the story. We think about framing. We think about who we're putting on. We think about the demographics of the sources that we're putting on television. We think about our audience. We think about the voters, the people who will be affected. Who are we talking to? And not just talking at people, but telling their stories in a responsible way, but also making sure not to shed too much light on not when I say too much light, I mean almost no light to conspiracy theories, with the exception of, when I say conspiracy theories, I mean to untruths, right? Without being very clear about it, and being very thoughtful about that, because like we said, we have so many elections going on right now, and they're all contested, and we have a lot of people that are ready to say whatever the outcome is, if it's not in their favor, they're ready to say that it's not true. So I think this is a question that I don't just have the answer to, that we will all have to put our heads together to really try to think about, because it's going to be a tough next couple of years. Right. And the answer is we will have to continue to put our heads together to see what that looks like.
Molly, I'm going to drag you into this conversation.
Sure. I don't have a global theory of how to fix journalism. I'm just trying to do my job. But I do want to say a couple of mildly provocative things. I think, first of all, as a journalist, I am not trying to make the world a better place. And none of us should be. It's our job to tell the truth. Because once we decide that we are invested in some kind of outcome, we become activists, we become advocates. And that, and this is the same reason that I don't make predictions when it comes to elections. When you think somebody's going to win, I think that shades your coverage in the direction of the outcome that you have predetermined in your mind. And I think that that is true for any kind of policy and for coverage in general. And so sort of related to that, and also sort of related to the covering democracy question, it's important that in standing up for democracy, we don't become protectors of bad institutions. Things aren't true just because the government says they are. And it's our job as reporters always to be questioning sources of information. So I do feel like I've seen a lot of knee-jerk, the government says the election wasn't stolen and we have to believe that. No, we have done our own investigations and we know, based on our own determination of the truth, but it's important that we don't just revert to, covering for institutions that in many cases are going to be corrupt.
Lily, Dana, y'all want to jump in on this?
So something that I've been thinking about is the question of just the notion that these things are going to come up because the times are tumultuous. And I would just like to know that journalists in newsrooms have had these conversations and have had to sit back and think about them a little bit, so that when there are actions that are taken, they're reflective, right? They're not just like, oh, this story happened and now I'm going to just cover it. This is how we cover this kind of story. And I think that would involve thinking a little bit about what are our ground rules. And you can say, you don't have like a dog in the fight, right? You don't have a particular outcome that you're invested in. But I do think that there are certain implicit things that even the most objective journalists would say, that behavior of that political candidate, that crosses some kind of a line. Like, for example, if there is a candidate who is endorsing political violence and doing so explicitly, right? I would imagine that journalists would have a sense that, like, that crosses some kind of a line, and it would probably then be described as such. And maybe it would be described in the sense of like, this is a violation of what most average Americans would consider reasonable campaign rhetoric, for example. But I would just like to know that those conversations are happening, and there is a deliberate reflection on what are our ground rules and what kinds of behaviors of candidates are we willing to characterize as norm violating or not. Yeah.
Lily?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that I don't know if we just don't think about it very much, but I think it's just really important to remember that the news media are the ones telling the story of America right now. They're the only ones who are presumably objectively telling that story, and so they're the only ones that we should even be trusting, or we think that we should be trusting to the extent that we even do trust. And so the way that that the media choose to cover things or not cover certain things can change the story, right? It actually shapes the story as it's being told. And so there's this like this popularism idea that the Democrats have these unpopular policies and that they should run on more popular policies. That actually tells people that Democrats have unpopular policies. That's what they just learned from that headline. And actually, it's not true. Like Democratic Party policies are some of the most popular. Republicans like them, if you just ask them about the policies. And so by claiming that something is happening, you just told people that it's happening, even if it's just your theory about whether it's happening. That's not objective news reporting, but even this like analysis work. So I just think it's really important for media to keep in mind that like, as they tell the story, they are also writing the story, and everyone who's reading it believes that that's the true story. And so if they leave things out, then those things aren't part of the story of America. And if they put things in, then those things become the story of America, and they become reality. And I think that amount of power isn't necessarily like, we don't really respect how much power is involved in being the storyteller.
I had a closing question, but I want to make sure that microphone's open. Does anyone have any burning question they want to ask our panelists? Come, and we'll make that the closing question.
Hi, I'm Alex Rothstein, a junior studying political communication here at SMPA. And I had a question for you all. Where do you think journalists should draw the line between purely reporting the words of political elites, let's say in he said, she said journalism, while also realizing that that could potentially uplift harmful conspiracy theories? For example, I think back when Obama was running for president, and a lot of the media reported the birther conspiracy theories, and they even would use words from, for example, Donald Trump about it. And I think maybe had they focused less on that, it wouldn't have necessarily been one of the larger stories of his run.
Well, I was going to say, so, when we're talking about certain words that are being used, and, unfortunately, a lot of times we as journalists, we go for the low-hanging fruit, right? I mean, we know the journalistic norms of deadlines and, oh, this is catchy, right? I mean, it happens. I think that sometimes journalists are using those words, putting those quotes on, getting those plays, sometimes even he, in the newsroom, right? Not all the time, but I'm saying in the moment, not thinking about the larger implications that it could potentially have. I think conversations about making sure that we're thoughtful about how to use or not use, right? Because we know framing, we can leave things out. It is our decision. And that's why, as we talk about putting this work out and putting out our stories every day, it is okay to leave certain things out. We need to be having those conversations. Everything that someone says should not make it on. And to give you an example, and I'll tell on myself, I started telling journalists in my newsroom, when I ran a newsroom, to stop putting certain quotes from certain people on. Donald Trump was one of them. And I'll say the reason why is because we were starting to use clips for no reason, absolutely no reason. So then it takes us knowing and paying attention to how this can be harmful and what is the newsworthiness of it, but also being brave enough and bold enough to talk about it in the newsroom, but also making sure that we don't just put it on Instead, leave it out. And that's okay to leave it out sometimes. And if you do put something in, make sure that we're giving it proper context and being able to explain what it means. And being able to you don't just say that it was wrong, but you explain to the audience in a digestible way why this is not true. So we're basically fact-checking in real time. And actually, there are a lot of journalists who are doing that. So let me just put that out there. I know some really good journalists, including some that I worked with at that time. You put something in front of them and they say, actually, that's not true. And they will tell you why it's not true. But I think in the larger conversation, people need to be journalists, right, need to be really thoughtful of when we use certain terms or certain quotes because they're fancy and shiny, that they have greater harm.
Anybody else want to jump in on that?
Well, I'll say, you do often hear this criticism of particularly a lot of political journalism, that it's just, stenography. That's an important function of political journalism, to tell people what their leaders are saying. And not everything we do is watchdogging and holding people accountable. Some of what we do is just giving people information, being a conduit for information that we have access to and our readers do not. I mean, I think this really became clear during COVID, right? When the hollowing out of so many local newsrooms meant that a lot of people could not get information about COVID rates and COVID protections in their local communities because all the news that they have access to is this sort of nationalized that doesn't give you a sense of the actual picture on the ground. And what people need in that situation is just, what did the governor say today? And yeah, maybe he told a lie and we call that out, but that's not the only thing we're doing as journalists. And I really, and I get that, what it is we select as being important or choose to foreground or what we decide is controversial, those are all complicated and contested decisions. But I do really have a problem with this idea that by platforming certain figures or ideas, we're legitimizing them and giving them currency, and therefore we should ignore things we don't approve of. I think that's a really bad idea, and I don't think that Trump won the election because we paid attention to him in 2016. Birtherism was a phenomenon that was happening in every, local Republican precinct meeting. The idea that in this day and age we can still be gatekeepers for information, I think that's just not true anymore. People can get that information anywhere, and they are. And so better for us to be out there trying, to the degree that people trust us, which isn't much, I get it, but trying to say, look, here's something you might have heard, here's something that's out there, but it's not true. I think we have to do that instead of trying to, I remember people saying, stop covering Sarah Palin, she's irrelevant, you're just, it's just clickbait. Well, it turned out that Sarah Palin was a really important precursor to the Trump sort of populist right phenomenon, and she did deserve all that attention. And the reason we were paying attention to her, yeah, it got clicks because people were responding to her. I remember going to, John McCain events before he named her to the ticket, and it was like crickets and 5 people in a room, and then all of a sudden she's having 10,000 person rallies. That's a really important piece of information about the American electorate that we are trying to understand and help people understand. I recently wrote a long profile of Marjorie Taylor Greene, and you have a lot of people saying, well, stop paying attention to her, that, she's just bad. She is a phenomenon, and she is an important person in our politics right now, both in what she represents and in the things that she is actually doing and moving and creating. So I think we have to pay attention to all of these things and try to contextualize them for readers, try to help people understand them, but you're not going to just ignore things and have them go away.
Dana, Lily, final words? Dana?
Yeah. So, I mean, if there is an entity that is, or an individual that clearly has some kind of appeal and, is moving people in some important way, that likely is telling a bigger story above and beyond that individual person. So, the idea that, yeah, we need to contextualize this and understand, like, what is the appeal, what's going on, why is this moving the needle in this way for these people? I still think what's important when you talk about the notion of context, what's key is, especially when you're talking about someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, being willing to say, here are the various falsehoods that she's advancing, here are the kinds of things that she's saying that have had, these negative consequences. Using that, like Jay Rosen would suggest, that truth sandwich where here's the truth, here's the thing that they say that is actually untrue, and again, here's the truth, and here's why this truth contradicts what they said. I think that is a challenging pursuit, and I think it's essential, because without that, I think there is a danger of focusing the spotlight without having that context.
Final words?
So I think one thing that we haven't talked very much about is what right-wing media is doing, and our main political news media has rules that they have to follow in terms of verification and truth-telling and figuring things out. The right-wing media don't follow those rules, and so part of this issue of having it's not just Trump saying birther rumors, but it's being parroted on Fox and on Breitbart and all of these news media outlets that have no responsibilities for truth. And in fact, they actively undermine the truth a lot of the time. And so for mainstream political news media to have to combat that but by playing by the rules, right? It's like an unfair game. I think that the only thing is to be able to say, like, this is out there. Yeah, that's what they're saying. They don't have verification for that. There's no evidence for that. We looked everywhere. We haven't been able to find it. Unfortunately, there's usually a backlash, and everyone who does fact checking gets called liberal, right? But ultimately, the fact that there is this huge media ecosystem out there that is not following the rules of journalism means that these stories are already out there, and it is helpful to have some trustworthy voices telling the truth about the lies.
Thank you.
I will tell you one frustrating thing that I read and I see a lot is this organization or this network has not independently verified the story. And my first response is, then why are you telling me the story? Dana, you had one more thing you want to jump in? We'll have to stop.
One essential piece of this, though, is like when Brian talked earlier about that moment of the Trump feedback loop and observing him at a rally, and then the One America Network reporting on what he said, and then he talks about what he saw on TV, and it was the same thing he said. I think that it's essential that people understand that there is no symmetrical thing happening on the left. And part of the story and part of the facts of the story in the US context right now is that machinery is asymmetrical. And that, to me, is a key piece of the story.
As you might expect, we could continue this conversation for the next 3 hours, and I don't think any of us would get bored. But unfortunately, we have run out of time. How about a great round of applause for our fabulous panel? And I will turn it back over to Rebecca for our closing.
So we're significantly over time. I will not hold you any longer, except to say thank you. I'm really grateful that you've been part of this conversation. I hope that you will take the challenging provocations that have come out throughout today's engagement and continue them in your own classrooms, in your own lives, in your own newsrooms, whatever it might be. Thank you again. The work continues for all of us.